This is the second segment of Module 1, where we will review some key conceptual frameworks, namely Rose's population perspective and approach to intervention, and Lincoln Felon's fundamental causes, and we'll draw heavily on the readings you were assigned. Some antecedents to social epidemiology that weren't social epidemiology per se. One we mentioned before, Emil Durkheim, a sociologist, in his seminal work called Suicide, published in 1897, he explored the different suicide rates among Protestants and Catholics by looking at the ecological level, looking at suicide rates in communities that were predominantly Catholic compared to those who were predominantly Protestant. And in this seminal piece of sociological research, Durkheim concludes that in the Catholic communities, levels of social control and cohesion were responsible for lower suicide rates at the community level relative to Protestant communities, which he characterized as having less levels of social integration. And this is a first kind of insight to thinking about group level differences and group level characteristics to explain a very individual outcome related to mortality such as suicide. Much more recently, Jeffrey Rose published the piece you read articulating his population perspective and approach to intervention. And I think this is a key insight, a lot of key insights in this piece that really reflect and shape and inform much of what we do and think about in social epidemiology. One of the first important insights from Rose's piece regarding a population perspective to understanding population health outcomes and patterns in populations is that factors that explain differences between individuals or cases among individuals within a population may not explain differences between populations themselves in the aggregate, where the outcomes are measured in terms of incidence or distribution. And this distinction, I think, is really nicely articulated in that article. Another key insight from a population perspective is the idea that what is normal for a given population is population specific, and therefore normality is perhaps variant across contexts. And that's just simply looking at differences in literally the normal distribution of a particular health outcome across populations, as we'll look at more closely in a moment. A third insight from Rose's population perspective that I think is very important is the problem of ubiquitous exposures. The idea that something in a given population that may be very important for determining the health of that population is difficult to isolate and identify if it is ubiquitous in that context. And it's only by comparing populations that we're able to potentially identify ubiquitous exposures that everybody has as important drivers of population health patterns. Another insight, or it's a related insight from Rose's piece, is what can be referred to as type 3 error, again relating to the contrast between how you explain population level outcomes and how you explain inter-individual variation. And this concept of type 3 error was nicely articulated in an article by Schwartz and Carpenter in the late 1990s, I think. What they refer to as the type 3 error here is the idea of having the right answer for the wrong question, and highlighting the fact that the differences, again, from this first insight, what determines individual cases or inter-individual variation may not be what determines the population level or the rate of an outcome in a population. And the type 3 error is if we, for example, try to explain the rate in a population by looking at the causes of inter-individual variation or cases, in which case we will have potentially the right answer, but for the wrong question. An example from their article refers to homelessness. So if we're trying to understand homelessness, the one question might be, well, who is it that becomes homeless? And therefore, what are the determinants of inter-individual variation in homelessness? But that question is very distinct from what are the drivers of homelessness in a given population, which is more accurately defined as a rate or prevalence for a level of homelessness in a population. And as they articulate, structural factors such as the amount of affordable housing are largely the determinants of the rate of homelessness, whereas individual level risk factors are more likely relevant to determine who actually becomes homeless. And if you change the characteristics of people who are homeless, these risk factors, the rate of homelessness will not change, since there will be some other people who have these risk factors and lose out in the competition for this limited commodity. So here is an illustration from Rose of the problem of ubiquity, or the difficulty in detecting invariant causes. Here you have the two distributions of systolic blood pressure among Kenyan nomads and London civil servants, and you see both follow a normal distribution, but that the mean there for these distributions is different. And although they are overlapping, one distribution for the civil servants is at every level higher than that of the Kenyan nomads. If we only look within the population of London civil servants, for example, we will be able to detect reasons for inter-individual variation. Why some people fall here, while some people follow here, close to the normal point of the distribution, and why some are on the low end of the distribution. But we won't be able to identify factors that explain why the entire distribution here is higher than the entire distribution here for Kenyan nomads. Rose also articulated a prevention strategy corresponding to this perspective, and he distinguishes between a high-risk approach and a population approach. So the high-risk approach corresponds to traditional kinds of public health intervention strategies where you screen a population at risk to identify those above a certain threshold, and then you target that high-risk group. And as he nicely articulates, there are a number of strengths to this approach. It can lend itself very nicely to a very tailored, targeted intervention that's really appropriate and designed for that high-risk population. Those who fall under that high-risk category are likely to be highly motivated to adopt whatever prevention strategies you're recommending, and therefore it's cost-effective. You're only investing in interventions that affect those at the highest level of risk. And similarly related, the benefit to risk ratio will be favorable. Those who are more likely to encounter risks associated with the prevention strategy are also those most likely to benefit directly from it. So again, here just illustrating the concept, this would be, here the so-called high-risk group above a given threshold level, and here you would just target those in the upper end of the distribution. The downsides or limitations of the high-risk approach is the challenge and cost of screening. Not only do you have to define what that threshold is to characterize people as high and low risk, but then you also have to develop means by which the population can be screened in order to be effectively categorized with accuracy. Also, the strategies that are used to target the high-risk population alone inevitably tend to be more palliative and temporary and not addressing structural root causes, the kinds of things that might be more ubiquitous, more the kinds of factors driving the entire distribution as opposed to just pushing people toward the upper end of that distribution. Again, relatedly, Rose argues that these strategies have in the end ultimately limited potential for individuals because they are more palliative and temporary, but also for populations because of the population paradox, which we'll elaborate on momentarily. And notably, again, thinking back to some of the core insights and approaches of social epidemiology, Rose argues that the high-risk strategy is behaviorally inappropriate. It's ignoring the fact that the entire distribution is something that's population specific, and that these definitions of normality are variant across populations. And by targeting just simply the high-risk population, as you've characterized it, and ignoring the rest of the distribution, is trying to divorce that tail from the mean. And his argument from the population perspective insight is that that's not very realistic to do, and that it's erroneous to try to separate what's pushing people into the higher levels of the risk distribution from what's going on with the rest of the distribution. In contrast, the population prevention strategy would seek to shift the entire distribution of exposures or risk factors. And as a result, the strengths of the approach are that it's much more radical, rooted in trying to address structural drivers and more upstream factors driving health distributions, the entire distribution of the population, and therefore has significant potential for the population as a whole. Again, this is because it has the potential to address the prevention paradox, which basically describes the seemingly contradictory reality that the majority of cases from a given population arise from those at low or moderate risk, and only a minority of cases actually come from that population defined as high risk. And this is simply because the number of people in the high risk group is relatively small, and that therefore at an aggregate level, even though those in the high risk category are at greater relative risk individually, the number of cases in absolute terms is going to come more from the low or moderate risk groups than from the high risk groups. An example that Rose uses to illustrate this is the case of Down syndrome and the risk factor of maternal age. Yes, most cases of, women who are at higher maternal age are at significantly greater risk of babies with Down syndrome. But most cases of Down syndrome will be born to younger women who are in the low risk category, just because this is simply the area, the part of the population where most women have children at a younger age. Accordingly, the majority of the burden of disease does not, in fact, arise from the high risk groups. Again, the flip side of the strength of the population strategy compared to the high-risk strategy is that it's behaviorally appropriate. If you're targeting the entire population, you're not asking individuals to be deviant from the social norms. You're trying to change the social norms themselves. The weakness, of course, is the flip side of this efficacy argument for benefit for the population. The prevention paradox is in that most of the individuals who will benefit from the intervention will not themselves necessarily perceive risk and therefore may be weakly motivated. And if risks are involved in the intervention, they may not be perceived to, or in actuality, outweigh the benefits to the individual. Okay, so again here, the contrasting illustration of the prevention strategy of Rose is, rather than isolating this high-risk population and only targeting here, we seek instead to move this whole distribution from here to here. Okay, that's all I want to say about Rose, and I strongly encourage you to read and reread this paper because I think this is a seminal piece that everybody in public health should be very familiar with and comfortable referencing, and especially it's relevant for social epidemiology. Now I'd like to turn to our second conceptual framework, fundamental causes. Again, a really important seminal piece by Lincoln Felon that I think has been very important in shaping the thinking of people in social epidemiology and well beyond, and specifically for very usefully generating a lot of testable hypotheses about the drivers of the emergence and persistence of disparities, social disparities in health. So here's some of the highlights and things I think we can glean from fundamental causes. One is the idea that one needs to contextualize risk factors to understand what puts people at risks of risks, and do so in order to avoid ineffective interventions. That if we don't take into account the social context, we again focus only on the individual level and do not appreciate what puts people at risk for risk factors or risk behaviors, we will fail to have a meaningful understanding of individual level risk, and likely design interventions that will ultimately be ineffective, because we don't address the social context. Fundamental causes also guides us to seek to understand and ultimately address the fundamental causes, the upstream social factors versus the more proximal risk factors and intervening mechanisms. And fundamental causes articulates a specific mechanism by which social disparities are produced. And that fundamental and persistent mechanism is the access to and ability to deploy resources in terms of things like money, knowledge, prestige, power, and connections. I'd like to pause here just to emphasize momentarily the focus here on one mechanism of several that we'll discuss, but one kind of broad category of mechanisms by which social factors are hypothesized to influence health, and that is by virtue of access to and ability to use effectively material and social resources. So fundamental causes is very much a model that posits resources, their ability to access and use them, as a major mechanism to explain social inequalities in health. And again, not just the lack of resources affecting health at the lowest end of the social order, but at every level of the social hierarchy or the social gradient, that the differential access to and ability to use resources to pursue health ends are the primary mechanisms of the model by which social factors affect health. The other thing that I'll pause here to emphasize about fundamental causes is that this is a model that is seeking to explain social inequalities in health. In contrast to Rose's model is really about explaining health overall at the aggregate level. And fundamental causes is not a model of health overall. It's really trying to explain the enduring existence of social inequalities in health. And more specifically, what the model is attempting to do is give us a way of understanding how social inequalities can be reproduced and in fact are likely to be reproduced over time. And I have my own little diagram here to try to illustrate that insight. There it is. Okay. So since we often talk about in this metaphor of streams, upstream, downstream, I've decided to embrace it. I'm from Alaska, so we have these braided rivers, so I've made myself a braided stream here. And here you're looking at the multitude of factors that might be on the pathways between here low socioeconomic status and generic bad health. So perhaps the one pathway is smoking. Smoking's bad for your health. We know it's patterned by socioeconomic status. Same with poor diet, and let's put one in here that's been in the news recently, a lot sugary soft drinks. So these are three, obviously this is not exhaustive, three pathways by which low socioeconomic status may translate into bad health. These are the proximal factors. These are the downstream factors compared to low socioeconomic status as the upstream factor. So let's illustrate some of these insights from fundamental causes. One is the idea that if you design an intervention to interrupt one of these pathways, these streams, and you don't take into account social context, you're not likely to be effective. So here we'll say our intervention is an education campaign to promote greater consumption of fruits and vegetables. So we mount our campaign in our community, but all we do is put up posters, hand out leaflets, basically try to educate people about the importance of fruits and vegetables and encourage them to increase their consumption. If we don't take into account structural factors like the lack of outlets for fresh fruits and vegetables, the increased cost often associated with fruits and vegetables, and the deprivation factors that mitigate people's ability to act on this knowledge, we really won't have blocked this channel of this stream. You can see it's still operative here. We would deem this intervention by any standards as being ineffective because without taking into account social context, you're simply not going to be successful in what you seek to do. And here, what you're seeking to do is simply interrupt the pathway between low socioeconomic status and poor diet leading to bad health. Now let's say you take to heart the insights from fundamental causes and you design a better intervention. And your better intervention is that you not only educate people about the importance of consuming fruits and vegetables, but you increase the presence of affordable fruits and vegetables in bodegas and communities, and you really address some of the structural barriers to consumption. And you're successful. You actually have blocked this channel here. See, the water goes back up. And you have blocked this relationship between low SES and poor diet, leading to bad health. However, so you would deem this effective in terms of what the intervention was seeking to do, right? But fundamental causes would deem this ineffective because fundamental causes is about interrupting, preventing, blocking, and mitigating the social inequalities in health. So the other thing that you've seen here in my little diagram is that the water goes back up this braid and it comes down through something else. This is the other key insight about how social inequalities in health are reproduced over time, even in the context of successful health interventions, right? So by not being effective in disrupting the fundamental SES health association, fundamental causes would argue this is not an effective approach to reducing overall social disparities in health because low SES will express its impact on health through other pathways. Other pathways will become the channels by which SES continues to exert its powerful effects on health outcomes and shaping the population distribution of health outcomes. Now, another extension of this is in terms of a kind of policy implication of fundamental causes, also articulated previously by Susser, another paradox. The idea that prevention efforts can have the perverse effect of widening social disparities in health outcomes. And again, think of the fundamental mechanism of fundamental causes is that the access to the resources and ability to use those resources to promote one's health are the important drivers of health outcomes and mechanisms of social inequalities in health. And so as they articulate very nicely, people with means will be able to better take advantage of new technologies, new information, new insights, new behaviors, etc., new resources available for health promotion. And in effect, by doing so, might widen or introduce disparities between social groups as a result. And here is a real-life example of this. Comparing smoking rates between 1973 and 2004, you have the prevalence of smoking in Great Britain along an axis of affluence. So the low end here, these are the folks with the most resources, most affluent, and the poorest. And what you can see is that between 1973 and 2004, at every level of deprivation, smoking prevalence went down, right? You can also see that in 1973, there was a relatively mild social gradient whereby prevalence was highest among those who were poorest, and then it went down gradually to the lowest level of prevalence among the most affluent. But what you see that really illustrates this insight from fundamental causes is that that gradient in 2004 is much steeper. It's gone down at every level, but the gradient here is much steeper in 2004. And you can see the fundamental cause interpretation here would be that the most affluent, those with the most resources, have over time been more effective in taking advantage of information, smoking is bad for you, and in avoiding the uptake of smoking, or more effective in adopting smoking cessation. And that the improvements that are differential for the more affluent relative to the less affluent have in effect created a widened disparity or a widened social gradient between the years 1973 and 2004. Okay, I just want to wrap up with a sort of summary of the two pieces here and how they compare and contrast. As I mentioned earlier, Rose's focus is on aggregate health improvement and generating the insight that more cases arise from low-risk groups, and that this is in fact one of the reasons why a population-level approach to prevention is important. And he argues that's efficacious because you can't divorce the tail from the mean. You can't take people out of their social context. And the approach of Rose is one, in effect, of diminishing the importance of individual agency. This is the put the chlorine in the water and don't depend on individuals to make choices that are different from other people, that they don't have to decide to use fluoride toothpaste or access fluoride on their own. We've simply by virtue of putting it in the water, taken away the necessity of individuals to seek out and make use of that resource to promote health. In contrast, Lincoln-Fellen's focus is on how to explain the existence and endurance of health inequalities and how to decrease them or mitigate them. The approach, they articulate, is efficacious also because it contextualizes risk. There's a real common thread there between the two models. But a nice contrast is, and I don't think in any way that these are competing models, I think they're very complementary, they're ones of different emphasis. Lincoln-Fellen, their argument is much more about strengthening individual agency by increasing the resources available to individuals or compensating for the lack thereof. And this points to a need to address social inequalities as an important determinant of health, rather than just making agency less important by intervening at the population level without necessarily focusing on or addressing anything about social disparities. And that's all for segment 2.